Lando Norris dominated the Singapore Grand Prix weekend in his McLaren, securing a commanding victory. From the moment practice began on Friday, he appeared poised for an impressive performance. However, early signs suggested that Charles Leclerc's Ferrari could challenge Norris's ambitions. On that first day, Ferrari looked like a strong contender, while Red Bull seemed surprisingly off-pace. Things changed for Ferrari on Saturday, as track conditions highlighted the car's tendency to struggle with front tire performance. But regardless of the on-track performance, what we saw over the weekend in Singapore represents exactly the evolution of Formula One in recent years. In Formula One, official communications are worth as much as the two of spades in most card games. This is also the case for Ferrari. It's a practice that isn't always certain, but has been confirmed for all teams throughout the history of the most important motorsport category. The reason is simple: blaming human error is never pleasant. It's much easier to place it in a broader context in order to divert attention and, in turn, soften the repercussions that such an issue could create within the team. However, when the evidence is too overwhelming, everything becomes more complicated. And watching interviews means seeing drivers who are now remote-controlled by the Formula One team's press offices, with every statement crafted for the good of the team. In the rare cases where a driver speaks spontaneously, the entire communication strategy collapses. What happened between Ferrari and Charles Leclerc in Singapore is just the latest example. With a very competitive car on street circuits, the Monegasque driver had to settle for starting from the fifth row. As we thoroughly explained yesterday, Ferrari's issue with the tire blanket wasn't the only problem, and without it, things likely wouldn't have changed too much. Just consider Sainz's car, which slid out at turn 18 as soon as the Spaniard's Ferrari took the corner seriously. Staying in the pit lane and losing time worsened the situation, as did the tactic of warming the tires less with the blankets before going out on track. This approach was meant to avoid overheating, which effectively reduces grip and consequently tire performance. After qualifying, Charles Leclerc's surprise was immediately evident in the post-session interviews. He explained that the front tires hadn't reached the proper temperature, which had impacted his sole Q3 attempt. Despite his efforts to warm them up, the lack of grip led to a lockup under braking. But what actually happened to Charles Leclerc's Ferrari SF24 single-seater before Q3? With all the technology available these days, it was possible to immediately analyze the onboard videos of the Ferrari driver to better understand what happened. Just 3 minutes before the Monegasque driver went out on track, something strange happened with the tire warmer on the front left. In the video, which was widely spread on social media immediately after the qualifying session for the Singapore Grand Prix, but has now removed from major social networks, you can see a Ferrari mechanic fiddling with the tire warmer cable, probably after realizing that it wasn't working. After a few seconds, another Ferrari mechanic was asked to fetch something from Carlos Sainz's side of the garage. He soon returned holding another cable, which was used to replace the one on the front left. It's therefore easy to infer that the problem Charles Leclerc mentioned was due to a malfunction, discovered too late, with the tire warmer. Human mistakes or technical errors can always take place, but what is more regrettable is the questionable strategy to cover up the mistake. As soon as the video went viral online, a strategy to cover up the mistake was put in place by Ferrari. Sources closest to Maranello rushed to deny, sadly and without any valid explanation, what anyone could clearly observe from the video. Further evidence supporting the tire warmer malfunction came right after the Singapore race during a little exchange between the Monegasque driver and journalists. Charles Leclerc, after a great and furious recovery drive, spoke freely to Sky, backtracking on his previous day's statements. He acknowledged that while the tires hadn't been at the right temperature during qualifying, he took full responsibility for the session. Leclerc admitted that his previous statements might not have conveyed the correct message. For a team that claims to want to fight for the Constructors' Championship in such a competitive Formula One season, results need to be maximized, especially on favorable tracks. Unfortunately, for years now, Maranello has been losing its composure in crucial moments, and the patience of drivers who love the red should not be taken for granted. It's hard to imagine that a Lewis Hamilton, as was the case with Fernando Alonso, would be asked to make a public backtrack to save the team. Yet it seems increasingly evident that in modern Formula One, embarrassing strategies are needed to cover up glaring mistakes like the one made by Ferrari in the qualifying session for the Singapore Grand Prix. much to the dismay of those, like the fans, who deserve clarity. Let's now take a step back and examine one of Ferrari's many curious behaviors. The most recent incident occurred with Charles Leclerc in Austria in June. Let's refresh our memory. The F1 car number 16 leaves the garage and suddenly, without any apparent reason, experiences a problem at the end of the pit lane, still in Q3. The SF24 goes into anti-stall mode and then shuts off. We're talking about a system designed to prevent the interruption of power. The strange part, which doesn't make sense, is that the mechanism activated when the car was in neutral. We all saw it clearly from the onboard footage, watching the dashboard on the Monegasque's steering wheel. After a few seconds, Charles performed a power cycle. The problem disappeared, and the car restarted. However, there wasn't enough time to complete the outlap, cross the finish line, and start his flying lap, especially considering that Charles Leclerc's car had to avoid interfering with drivers who were already on their fast laps. As a result, the Monegasque driver couldn't set a valid time in Q3 and was left holding the so-called short straw. At that point, he opened the radio and asked for clarification, pointing out that it was the anti-stall system that had shut off the engine, even though the system is meant to prevent engine stalls. This was, therefore, an unprecedented issue. His race engineer Brian Bozzi provided no explanation at that moment and preferred to cut it short, saying they'd discuss the incident behind closed doors. Now, given that all the lights on the steering wheel were flashing and the car was in neutral, it was most likely a software malfunction, an issue with the control unit that cut power to the power unit. After recalling the event, the question arises: what was Ferrari's reaction? None. Silence. Was there a response to the question everyone was asking? Unfortunately, no. The Formula One team based in Maranello chose to gloss over the issue to focus on what they considered more pressing matters. Failing to provide a plausible explanation is typical in these situations, and Ferrari is certainly not the only one to do so. This is just one example that doesn't inspire confidence in the press toward the team. The same goes for the cold and concise press releases, filled with empty words. Another example is the Enrico Cardile case. The former technical director of the Italian side left the team to join Aston Martin. Why did he leave? Again, no explanation, just the usual formalities. The same reasoning was used by McLaren when they let go of former Ferrari engineer David Sanchez. In that case, there was a reason, although it seemed rather absurd. We say this because the claim that the French engineer left due to a role misalignment is a classic cop-out used in order to avoid telling the true story. Returning to the present, no one imagined Ferrari's frantic mechanics rushing to figure out what was happening with the front left. The images are there, for everyone to see. The same goes for Charles Leclerc's complaints over the radio and the incorrect tire values on car number 16's dashboard. Denying something so obvious with your hands in the cookie jar might make sense when you're a child. As adults, definitely not. And while a lie hides better between two truths, claiming that the tire blanket played no role in the issue is an utterly ridiculous excuse.